The temperature's a crisp -2 degrees on this mid-January morning. A recent snowstorm has piled up over a foot of the white magic, and the rising sun reveals a near cloudless sky. All of the ingredients for a perfect day of railroad photography are present as we look north, viewing the expanse of the frozen Mississippi River from the U.S. Highway 18 bridge at Marquette, Iowa. We've come to the Midwestern heartland in search of big-time railroad action in the depth of winter. Uncertain of how long it will take to encounter our first train, we're pleasantly surprised as Soo Line number 431 makes its way down along the river's west bank. The St. Paul to Kansas City freight slows as it nears the historic Old River town of Marquette. A junction here connects with the Sue's track across northern Iowa through Mason City. All of this trackage once belonged to the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, and was acquired by the Soo Line in 1986. Most Soo Line trains operating along the river on the Dubuque Sub and trains on the line between Chicago and Kansas City are run with cabooses. In this era of rear-end devices, it's refreshing to view the traditional crummy bringing up the rear of a train. But even here, the cabooses won't be around forever. Trekking into the upper Midwest during the coldest part of winter, our goal is to cover the railroad action of an area rather than that of a single railroad line. We chose the upper Mississippi River between Clinton, Iowa and Winona, Minnesota because of its diversity. Several different railroads operate lines through this scenic part of the heartland with predictable train frequency. Soo Line's tracks between Winona, Minnesota and La Crosse, Wisconsin are a part of our coverage, as well as their line south along the west bank of the river. Their Chicago to Kansas City line is also included and joins our coverage area at Savannah, Illinois. Together, the combined lines continue on to Clinton, Iowa, where they cross over the busy Chicago Northwestern Main Line. Action on the CNW is also included. Burlington Northern's main line along the Mississippi is a high-density corridor of commerce that sees everything from priority intermodal shipments to Canadian national run-through trains. It even includes low-priority locals and ore drags. The double-tracked main is a busy railroad, and as you'll see, it's also a very scenic line. The area's regional carriers are also included. At Dubuque, Iowa, the Chicago Central displays its bright red locomotives. At its eastern terminus in Winona, Minnesota, the Dakota, Minnesota and Eastern interchanges cars with the Chicago Northwestern. Our coverage concludes with a look at winter railroading on the Green Bay and Western as train number 2 heads east. Soo Line train 431 continues its southbound journey along the Mississippi River. Just outside Gutenberg, Iowa, the line snakes along the bluffs. At milepost 50, just north of Dubuque, the train's crew nears the completion of their run. Dubuque is the crew change point on this line. The newly legalized industry of riverboat gambling has brought new life to the cities along the Mississippi. At Dubuque, boats are tied up for the winter. The influx of tourists has helped cities like Dubuque to rebuild their crumbling old downtown areas and has rejuvenated their sluggish economy. The train passes through Dubuque Junction, where it crosses over the rails of the Chicago Central, a regional carrier that runs on the former Illinois Central line across Iowa. With a fresh crew now on board, train 431 heads toward Clinton, Iowa. We'll let the Soo train continue on its way and move our attention over to the Burlington Northern tracks at East Dubuque on the Illinois side of the river. The old CB&Q station remains standing and is now used by the railroad's maintenance crews. Eastbound BN train 146 rolls through East Dubuque and is pulled by a fleet of rebuilt locomotives. A Canadian National train passes through East Dubuque Junction on its way north. A new arrangement, implemented a few months before we shot this video, allows the CN to run into Chicago over BN's tracks. Locomotives of the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific, Grand Trunk, and Canadian National are now seen along the Mississippi. Burlington Northern crews operate these run-through trains. On a cloudy morning, we're set up at the staffed interlocking shack at East Dubuque Junction. A Chicago Central Jeep has completed its work and is ready to depart. The local freight will head back across the river to Iowa just as soon as the brakeman throws the switch and climbs aboard the car. The Jeep will pull through a curved tunnel and cross over the BN main at right angles. On another day, a CC road train from Chicago nears East Dubuque. Back on the Iowa side of the river, Chicago Central train number 51 passes through the junction with the Soo line. After stopping to make a set out at the yard, the train eases out of town around a sharp curve and will pass over the bridge. The train is under a speed restriction as it climbs up out of the Mississippi River Valley. The brilliant red paint on the newly acquired Jeep 38s gleams in the bright sunlight. Some of these units once worked for the Monongahela Railway in Pennsylvania, and others came from Conrail via the Gateway Western Railroad. Passing the signal, the train has reached the end of the restricted speed, and the units are throttled up to attain road speed. At the village of Piasta, the train roars past as it nears the top of the long curve. Back on the Illinois side of the river, a BN train passes through Blanding. This location is near the Savannah Army Depot between the towns of East Dubuque and Savannah. A beautiful panoramic vista of the Mississippi River Valley is seen from atop the bluffs of Mississippi Palisades State Park. The highway bridge between Savannah, Illinois and Cibola, Iowa is seen in the distance. Down below, a BN train heads toward Chicago on its way downriver. Navigation on this part of the Mississippi is shut down during the winter months. It will be mid-March before the towboats once again ply the waters of Old Man River. As the eastbound train rounds the curve into Savannah, a northbound comes into view from around the bend. A switch engine, perhaps being transported from the shops at Burlington, Iowa, trails behind the road power. On another day, shooting from ground level, we look back toward the bluffs of the park. Canadian National Train 340 is today powered with Grand Trunk engines. Both of these diesels once belonged to the Union Pacific and have had their dynamic brakes removed. A couple miles south, in town, the Soo Line tracks cross over the BN Main. A Jeep 30 leads an eastbound freight across the diamonds. Right on the heels of the first train, a second freight comes across the diamonds. After crossing the BN, Soo's trains run along a levee on the river's edge and cross over the Mississippi on this swing bridge. Train 229 makes its way toward the river crossing. Rounding a sweeping curve, the train heads onto the bridge. It's traveling from Chicago to Kansas City. As with most Soo trains on this line, a caboose brings up the rear. On another day, we find ourselves located down in Clinton, Iowa. A Soo Line Jeep 9 has just performed a flying switch move and quickly gets out of the way. A Chicago Northwestern freight heads west as the Soo Line switch job continues working. A Burlington Northern engine and caboose are parked on the industrial spur. BN gets to Clinton over the tracks of the Dry Line, the Davenport, Rock Island, and Northwestern. The switching line is jointly owned by the BN and the Soo Line. 20 minutes later, a Soo road train has arrived at the Northwestern crossovers. Having obtained permission from the CNW dispatcher to come across his iron, train 430 heads our way. This train runs between Kansas City and St. Paul, Minnesota. Running just a few minutes behind train 430, Soo Line 228 comes across the CNW on its way from Kansas City to Chicago. Back at Clinton in the late afternoon, an APL stack train heads east. 3 UP locomotives power this train of hot cargo from the West Coast. Sweeping around a curve, the train heads on to the Mississippi River Bridge that carries the rails into Illinois. Over the years, it's been our pleasure to present interesting scenes along the tracks that are not necessarily railroad related. We take particular pride in showing pictures of wildlife that we've observed. Now, the most spectacular sight we've ever seen is the hundreds of bald eagles that winter along the upper Mississippi. During these months, the birds converge to the open water created by dams along the river. The eagle's primary food is fish, and a bountiful source keeps these kings of the air well nourished during the harsh winter. At Lock and Dam number 9 near Lynxville, Wisconsin, the giant birds circle over the water, keeping a sharp lookout for an unwary morsel. When not actively looking for dinner, they can be seen perching in trees along the waterway. At this one location, we counted over 60 eagles. The immature birds don't have the characteristic white heads and tail feathers of the adult bald eagle. These juveniles molt over the years and obtain the mature look when they reach 4 years of age. Just north of the dam, a Burlington Northern pig train heads downriver toward Chicago. Canadian National Train 341 passes through Ferryville. These are the same 2 locomotives seen heading south a couple of days earlier. Airboats are common along the Mississippi and are used to travel through the river's many miles of marshland. Approaching the town of Stoddard, Wisconsin, the train's passing stirs up clouds of snow. Located about a mile west of Grand Crossing on the Sioux Line, the La Crosse passenger station is still used twice daily by Amtrak's Empire Builder. A coal train powered with Chicago Northwestern locomotives passes the old station. Just around the bend from the station, a Sioux local freight waits to enter the main. But first, a BN-powered coal train will pass through town. Once the coal train has cleared, a brakeman performs the dreaded winter task of sweeping snow out of a switch. The Sioux Jeep 38-2 has permission to enter the main and heads off to work. On another day, we've set up on the Minnesota side of the river and watch as a single SD-60 pulls its long train across the swing bridge. A caboose brings up the rear of the Chicago to St. Paul train. Another single SD-60 pulls a Chicago to St. Paul Sprint train across the bridge. It's common for the Sprint trains to be powered with a single locomotive. Around the curve and a half-mile north is River Junction. This is where the Chicago, Maine and the Iowa line along the Mississippi meet, creating the river subdivision. A Chicago-bound train passes through the junction. Later, several miles north, Sioux train number 222 heads up the line near the small town of Dakota, Minnesota. A scenic overlook in town provides a good place for train watching. stopped at Dunhauer Siding, 222 is in the hole to meet Amtrak number 8, the eastbound Empire Builder. The train passed through a heavy winter snowstorm in the Spokane, Washington area and is running 4 hours late today. Once Amtrak has passed, the dispatcher lets the St. Paul-bound freight continue on its way. At Winona, Minnesota, a Chicago Northwestern train backs into the yard. The caboose's wheels cut a path through the newly fallen snow. If you're wondering why the train is backing into the yard, there's a simple explanation. The CNW once had their own line into Winona coming into town on a bridge across the Mississippi. Several years ago, they decided not to repair their bridge and opted for trackage rights over the Suze line from La Crosse. Trains must pull north of town and then back through a switch to access the yard. The Green Bay and Western at one time also crossed over the river into town on their own bridge. They opted to discontinue service into Winona when their bridge was damaged. These blue 40-foot boxcars are used to haul wood chips from Minnesota to Consolidated Paper in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. The first track is full and the train is cut to double the yard. The rest of the cars are backed into the yard. This train operates out of Adams, Wisconsin, and interchanges most of its traffic with regional carrier Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern. The DM&E operates over what was once Northwestern's line to Huron, South Dakota. The Northwestern power eases back into the yard and will come to a stop. Later, the locomotives will be taken over to the service facility. Near Red Mound, Wisconsin, B&M empty ore train NT-401 heads back to Superior for another load of taconite pellets. Note that the two wide-nose SD60s have different style cabs and slightly different paint schemes. We've returned to Clinton, Iowa to conclude our tour of the upper Mississippi River Valley. A Sioux local backs around the curve near the CNW Bridge. Right behind the local, Sioux Line train number 381 crosses over the Northwestern to reach its own rail. This Muscatine to Mason City, Iowa train hauls mostly grain. A short while later, another Sioux train, the 228, has crossed over the CNW tracks and comes around the curve to head up the river. The Chicago Northwestern signals indicate that a westbound is approaching. As the train comes through the bridges, we see that it's an empty coal drag headed back to the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. As the sun sets over Clinton, the Soo Line runs one more train through Northwestern's crossovers.